Welcome back to part 2 of playing around with Texture Magic. I'm going to show you another way that you can use Texture Magic in applique, but first I want to show you another cool way to create texturized fabrics that can be used for either applique or piecing. Remember that in part 1 we showed you how to stitch the Texture Magic and fabric together and then apply the steam to shrink them, and we ended up with a really neat piece of crinkly textured fabric. Now that was pretty cool, but there's even more that you can do with this Texture Magic. Well, this time I'm going to show you how to create a Trapunto texturized piece of fabric. Now Trapunto, remember, is a technique where you can add one or more extra layers of batting to a focal area on a quilt, and it will cause that part of the quilt to poof out a bit and be more prominent than the rest of the quilt. Well, with Texture Magic, there are actually two different ways that you can create a Trapunto layer, and they will each look completely different from one another. For the first method, you'll start out just like before, except this time you'll baste together a piece of fabric, then batting, and then your Texture Magic layer. Use whatever kind of batting you desire. Here I'm using wool batting. Now make sure that the Texture Magic side is exposed, because that's the part that will eventually be steamed. You'll stitch them together just like before, using whatever stitch design you like. Notice that unlike last time, I'm stitching this time with the Texture Magic side facing up, and I'm just doing this so you'll see that it will work fine both ways. Once they're stitched together, we apply steam just like before, and voila, we have a new piece of texturized fabric that already has a Trapunto layer, and we haven't even begun our applique. If you compare the fabric on the left with the fabric on the right, you can really tell the difference. Both of these silk fabrics were stipple stitched, but the fabric on the right, which has no Trapunto layer, has a tight, tiny, crinkly look, whereas the fabric on the left, which we texturized with a Trapunto layer, has full, plump puckers. Now remember, you can also do Trapunto with Texture Magic in the traditional way that I showed you earlier in the Trapunto tutorial. This would involve adding an extra scrap of batting underneath an applique shape that had already been stitched to the top of a quilt or fused down to the top of the quilt. This quilt top will give you an idea of the difference. Each flower on this top has been Trapuntoed, and the center of each flower has an additional layer of batting added either during the texturizing process or as in the traditional method. This first flower center was created with just Texture Magic and fabric, then everything was fused together like I showed you in the earlier Texture Magic tutorial. Once it was fused to the background fabric, I added an extra layer of batting under the center of the flower. Now let's look at our second flower. This flower center was created by texturizing with an extra layer of batting, then fusing the flower together, and then fusing the flower to the background fabric and adding another layer of batting underneath the entire flower. If we compare it to the first type of flower, they are really very different. Now you can use a Trapunto texturized piece of fabric in applique just like we did in the last Texture Magic tutorial, or you can cut out your applique shape and lay it on the piece of fabric and then stitch it into place. So I'm going to show you how to do this new way by making a really scary three-dimensional spider on a Halloween candy bag. I'll take a piece of texturized fabric, cut it into the applique shape, and stitch it down. I'm starting with a piece of crushed velvet that I've already texturized with a Trapunto layer, exactly in the way that I showed you before. I simply trace the shape of the spider body that I'm going to applique, and then I stitch an outline just outside my traced line, precisely like I showed you in the first Texture Magic tutorial. Now remember, I'm doing this step because once I cut into my texturized fabric, it will release the puckers along the perimeter of my applique shape, but by adding this stitched line, my puckers will all be preserved. Once my stitching is done, I cut out my applique shape and I'm ready to go. Okay, so I have cut out the main body section of my spider, and the whole reason I'm going to this trouble is I really want to texturize this part to make this spider even creepier, because I know kids and I know they'll go like that and go, ew, and then look, I want to touch it again. So that's the effect we're going for. So first thing I'm going to do is I need to stabilize it while I'm stitching it in place. And all I'm going to do is put a little bit of fabric glue on it. You don't need much. And then I'm going to get it into place. Notice for this particular motif, the spider body is not as big as the actual spider. There's a good reason for that, and I'll tell you that later on. But there, I've got it in place, and already you can start to appreciate. This is going to give 3D because I've trapuntoed this crushed velvet. There's batting under it. So I've got a 3D effect. It's protruding out, and it's got this really weird worm-like texture. Okay, now we're ready to stitch it. Here, I am using a simple satin stitch to permanently attach this applique to the candy bag, but you could use other stitches as well. The key to attaching a trapuntoed and texturized applique shape is to hide the batting layer with your stitching, and a dense satin stitch works really well for that purpose. Now, normally, you would not need to have placed a fusible applique shape underneath a piece of trapuntoed texture magic that you wanted to use for applique. I did it here because I really love the intricate detail of those skinny spider legs, and there's just no way that I could neatly cut out and edge finish those legs using the texturized piece for the entire spider. So, when you find yourself in a bind like this, improvise as I'm doing here, and you'll get the wonderful three-dimensional texture on the spider's body, and yet you'll still preserve those great spider legs. Okay, now all the stitching's done. I want you to notice a couple of things. One is we have really just the most lovely, disgustingly creepy texture, and that is what we were going for. So crushed velvet has a great sheen. It's not showing up all that well on the camera, I don't think, but in real life, this is creepy stuff to texturize. Think about using it for something for Halloween. The other thing I want you to notice, remember I cut my template for my texturized fabric smaller than the body of the spider, and I did that because I think all these weird little creepy things add something, and I'm not a patient satin stitcher, and I knew there was no way that I could get my edge of the texturized fabric to look as good as this, so I made my template a little bit smaller and just did a really fast satin stitch inside, and the applique shape itself doesn't lose anything because I took that kind of cheater step. Now, one thing I did forget to tell you, there are places up here in the head particularly where the satin stitching I knew would go just outside the area of fusible web, and for that reason I did iron a stabilizer, temporary stabilizer, to the back side of this. So what I need to do now is I'm flipping it over, and you can see here we've got our satin stitched area. We're just going to rip all that off, and now once I get all this off, and that also is going to include this inside zone, and I used two layers. It was probably overkill, but we've got a really nice finished spider that is really going to scare some kids. So, if you're looking to add even more interest to a texturized piece of fabric, think of adding a trapunto layer before you texturize, and you'll come out with a more pronounced three-dimensional effect. Now stay tuned for the next segment on other cool ways to use texture magic.